This is Leisha Holmes, and I'm your host on the Recruiters Recruitment Podcast, kindly brought to you by Hoxo Media. I'm really thrilled to be welcoming today a familiar face to those of you who follow me on Facebook. This is James Frith, and I'm going to introduce him. Hopefully I'll do you justice. He is the Senior Counsel at Atticus Communications, former Parliamentarian, Select Committee, social entrepreneur, and very proud father of 4, and also husband to an entrepreneur, Nikki Frith of Granny Cool Marmalades. So welcome to the channel today, James. How are you?
Thank you, Leisha. It's good to be with you. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Me too. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. So I've invited you on here because obviously we got to know each other through school, both parents at the local primary school, and obviously through your MP career as well. But you actually have got a recruitment history, haven't you? So you left behind a recruitment career and moved into Parliament. How did that happen? How did that jump happen?
Well, it was quite a big leap between the 4 years in recruitment to then I ended up in Parliament. But definitely my political career started literally as I ended the involvement in recruitment. I was out of university in sort of bits and bobs jobs, having studied in Manchester and then living in Manchester. And I got a job interview with a recruitment company called Badenoch & Clark, who are a fairly well established. They're now owned by Manpower, I think, or Adecco, but very specialist interim accounts. And I'll be honest, I mean, I sort of went along because I thought, I've got to get a job now. And my old man had said, you've got to get a job now. And I went along, and actually the process of the interview was the first thing that impressed me about the sector as a whole, to be honest, because a junior member of the team meets you first. They hand it up to then a senior member of the team, and then the regional director is, if you get a third interview, is involved. And then actually, if the job offer happens, it's conditional to you meeting the team you're going to work with, which was a really, it was an exhausting process, and I was a bit like, blooming heck, am I joining MI6 or something? But it was actually, as the process went on, I got more engaged about it, more enthusiastic about it. And I realized, because I was then on the other side of things doing the same thing and reached different levels of that process, that actually the sales process is as much about the pitch for the company for you to come and work for them as it ever is about the individual. And I thought that was quite that was a definite moment of learning for me, and something that ran constant through my career, my 4-year career in recruitment, which is how they invest in people, albeit with the motivation of a good fee or a good contract with a good gross profit margin, but nevertheless investing in people's skills, their abilities, their knowledge, their sort of teamwork, celebrating their independence and ability and confidence and all of that. So I've got a lot of good things to say about the recruitment industry, and I think a lot of other industries could learn from it.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really pleased you said that, because that's a really sort of advocate thing to say from outside of it now, because obviously you have moved away. So what made you leave the recruitment sector and pursue a career in politics?
Well, I if I'm honest, I mean, if I've been extremely flattering in the first answer, I might not be quite as flattering in the second answer. If I'm honest, I felt that having kind of got into it, I'd done all right at it. I'd enjoyed the time there, and I burnt the candle at both ends for 4 years, and was earning good money as well. Living in the centre of Manchester, I was having a riot. It was great. But I felt ultimately it wasn't the path I wanted to be on. I wanted a vocational, political based career. And in fact, rather cheekily, I realized that the company I was working for offered sabbaticals to people that had been with them for 3 years or so. And I remember having a conversation with the regional director, who said at the time, look, you're going to go on this sabbatical, you're going to have 2 months off, you're going to come back and then you'll leave. And I went, oh, no. And that's what I did. I went away, I did 2 months, and I thought, no, it's not just about going back and giving my all, actually. And so I left without a job to go to, but with the promise of a second interview for a 12-month contract with the Labour Party, and that was in 2005. And I landed on my feet with that, and I was then involved politically, from there on in.
Oh, it's wonderful. I love that. That's what your regional director always had the foresight that was what was going to happen.
Well, she then found, whilst I was on sabbatical, she then found my CV on one of the jobs. she rather told me off for that. But I mean, I think it swings and roundabouts ultimately.
Of course it does. It was clearly what the universe intended. So, I mean, look, when you started your political career 2005, or you joined the Labour Party, social media was really not quite there. I think it was about 2007, 2008. So given where we're at now, it's become such a massive part of our lives. And I think perception versus reality gets talked about a lot, particularly as brand has become so important in recruitment. People share the content on LinkedIn and across all the different channels. So your life, the reality of being an MP. So, fast forward to when you became MP for Bury North, what's the perception of life to what we expect through the social media that people share?
It's a good question. I think social media generally is a tool for people in public life, of elected officials or otherwise. If they want to reach out and engage authentically, it's a terrific asset for that engagement, and I embraced it. I would share my frustrations as much as my victories, and I think it's quite important. You can see through MPs that are sort of turn up for the good times, but duck the issues, the controversial issues, the needly issues, the things that divide us. Whereas for me, politics is as much about the cut and thrust of debate and arguing and with the competition of ideas, as it is about party politics or party allegiances or party machinery. And for me in Bury North, I understood that being a marginal seat, there were always going to be those that sat on the fence and opted to go one way one election and different way the other. So and actually that was my upbringing. My dad was a Church of England minister. We ideas and debates and arguments were commonplace in the household, and so I'm really comfortable with that. And I use social media, so we did Facebook Lives, we would do hashtags on Twitter. I build my following on both, understanding that Facebook tended to be better for the local side of things. Twitter was a bit more of a national conversation or a contribution at a national level. So I think it's great, but you're right. In 2005, it was non-existent. 2007, I think I signed up to Facebook in 2007, something like that, and LinkedIn a bit after that. But yeah, I mean, social media has changed everything, but it gets a pretty bad name, and not incorrectly in some senses, but generally speaking, it's a terrific medium to communicate with authenticity.
And I think that's I was just about to say that very sentence. Authenticity for me is how when I think about some of the discussions you would get involved in on Facebook. We have a local group, What's On in Ramsbottom, and I'm sure anyone that's listening to this in your local community, you will have a What's On in, whether it's Bedford or Hartlepool or wherever. And you were so genuine and unique in the fact that you weren't being political when you were responding to people's concerns. People would tag you and you would just respond as another resident, but actually as our MP. And I think that's where you have people listening to this in recruitment, having an authentic voice will absolutely set you apart in what you're trying to achieve. And you did that with absolute aplomb. And I think possibly without thinking about it. Did you just do that because that's just...
Oh, yeah. I mean, I am somebody that, it's something I'm having to manage now with the pandemic, as we all are, but I don't switch off particularly easily, or I go too far, so I'll go out and enjoy too much red wine, or I'll go to a gig and have a good time. But actually, I'm fairly incessant on communicating, and if I get something in, I've had to learn. It felt profound to me. It's certainly not necessarily automatically profound to anyone else, but somebody once drew the distinction between a reply and a response. And I think this was really powerful for me, particularly when you would get tagged, for example, as you say, or a random email, or suddenly something was brought to your attention. And in that moment, you've got to decide, right, is what I'm going to say simply to reply to it, i.e., directly on the issue that's being asked, or potentially around the sentiment or the tone in which it's being asked, or am I responding? And a response is a more patient response, is slightly more controlled. A response is not necessarily in the time that others have demanded. And that was a real powerful shift of thinking for me, that provided a response was coming, that was the thing to focus on, as opposed to, which, for example, 11 o'clock last night, I got quite a snotty message from somebody, and thought that's fine. Ordinarily, I might have got, not ordinarily, previously, I might have got drawn into a WhatsApp battle at 11 o'clock. Actually better at 9:15, just to lay out with calm measure, and that's the response sort of insight rather than the reply insight.
Having done by now 70 odd podcasts, I've never discussed this with anybody else, and that is a seismic, but it's tiny, but seismic mindset shift, because response is an actual action, isn't it?
It is, and it's you talk about branding, and you talk about authenticity, credibility. So I reflect on three words of value, if you like, and that is authenticity, credibility, and originality. Those are the three things that I try to bring to my activities, my political activity, my campaigning, my work. So that might be, speaking truth to power respectfully. It might also be, blimey, he's the MP and he's just replied to me, fine. But actually being consistent with that is important. One thing I would bemoan something of social media is actually what's on Ramsbottom has since become it's dominated now by people that work for the current MP in administration. So the admin people work or are associated to. So they proclaim this sort of apolitical status, but far from it. They are promoting one cause over and above another. So there are issues with social media, particularly when social media will proclaim to be something that actually it isn't, and that disingenuous side to social media is, it's dangerous, it's slippery.
I know, and I'm really pleased that you came up with that caveat, because I think that people are becoming much more savvy and much more aware to see through all the bullshit, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think definitely people can see that, and I really appreciate your stance on that, because I think I can see the different handles that you have on Twitter. You can be talking about something on a national basis, and then you're sharing your latest purchases from Wax and Beans. You are very real on there, James. Yeah. And I bet you can't wait to get back to gigs. I bet that's something you can't wait to.
Oh, I cannot wait. I mean, that is two, 3 cans of lager in the middle of a field with loud music and a couple of mates is just like, absolutely on the button.
We're recording this in March. By the time this goes live, hopefully that is going to be the
hopefully reality. I'll be in a field with mates and a couple.
Might not quite be, sort of middle of the spring. So look, in terms of your career, you really have got this, incredibly eclectic career so far. And one of the key things that inspires me about you is that you're always innovating and sort of colluding to inspire young people and create a better opportunity for them. So bearing in mind our audience is mainly recruitment leaders, what can recruitment leaders do to ensure that we're creating opportunities for the next generation?
Gosh, that's a good question. If for a start, hire young people and give them freedom to express, and recognize that the way in which they express themselves or contribute may be through a different medium with which you're accustomed, to which you're accustomed. And what do I mean by that? Well, in a company I used to run 8-9 years ago, we were a creative tech company. We had coders, but they were expensive, and the research and development costs were significant. We were a small business. We were developing tech for use online. We'd moved from a sort of desktop publishing to a Sky TV model, really, of subscription model and software as service. But to get any sort of research and development or ideas creatively from the very people that had built the thing that we were using was quite difficult for 2 reasons. Firstly, I couldn't speak to them beyond an understanding that I had learned mostly through what they had helped me learn, right? So the challenge was difficult. If the sort of the science behind it, or the coding and the restrictions to that innovation, I would be met with, no, it's just not feasible, right? So I thought, how are we going to get around this? So I hired a young person on an apprenticeship who was busy making up games overnight, random codes that then became a game using a particular JavaScript. And over time, he wouldn't say boo to a goose. He'd barely look at you sort of as we would address each other, and in a board meeting, in the boardroom, in a team meeting, you wouldn't get anything from him. But if he had a thought afterwards, he'd go back to his desk, open up Messenger, and fire you a series of ideas, countering a view, offering an insight, etc., etc. So we set him off on this sort of R&D development. And sooner or later, as he grew in confidence, of course, he started contributing to the team meetings. But in the first instance, his comfort was to communicate through a medium that he felt most at home with. Yeah. Which reflecting on that time, we could well have lost patience with Cameron, this lad, because he's like, come on, Cameron, what are you saying? What are you doing? And then actually over time, he became the challenge. He became a kind of challenger employee to really smart people, but very well established, very kind of set in their ways, who were kind of building their own citadels, their own dominions, and didn't want to be disturbed by people like me pushing the thing on. And so that challenge is really constructive. So I would say to any recruiter, if you've not got young people in your team, in your workforce, you're missing a trick. Yeah. First of all, do your bit for the economy. The highest proportion of young people people out of work because of the pandemic are young people. Yeah. Secondly, you don't know what you don't know, but they may well, and they should be coming in to encourage you to think differently, to innovate, to take a different perspective on things. But don't expect them to come in straight away, as is often the case when I used to speak to employers. Actually, as a recruiter, you would have a kind of middle-aged hiring man, often manager, saying, "Oh, youth today, bemoaning this," and thinking, I'm not sure you were a much cop at 18 without the opportunities you were then given, right? And this is what we do. We end up judging young people based on 20, 30 years in career, learning the culture, the parlance, the body language, the abilities, the investment that we all receive, and then expect a kid from college to walk in and be bossing it and be up to that level. And yet that's a complete misinterpretation of the opportunity that's there. So that would be my one piece of it. Young people are incredibly resilient, and they should be enabled and encouraged to challenge the status quo, because ultimately they're going to be the ones that take this economy on and make sure that we've got people to look after us and pay for our bills and all sorts if the government ever comes up with a social care plan. Absolutely.
And, everyone's going to be cheering. I'm goosebumpy all over with what you've just said. Totally everything that you've said. And, I know Shannon doesn't quite qualify as a school leaver, but she's young enough, I should say, to be my daughter. And I have learned so much from her. You learn from young people. I'm a parent of teenagers. They're always teaching me stuff about social media. They probably know more about that than I could. So everything that you said, no, that's a massive takeaway from this. So I mentioned Nikki at the start of this podcast. So Nikki is your beautiful wife and mother of your 4 children, and she's also an entrepreneur with Granny Cool. We'll make sure that's tagged in this as well. So You're both entrepreneurs. Do you think this is something that you are born with, or is this something that naturally evolves over a period of time through education, through opportunity? Given that you've got 4 children, have you got entrepreneurs in your blood?
I think we probably have. It's definitely a mindset. I think you can be preconditioned to being a entrepreneur sooner than others might be, but I think there are entrepreneurial qualities in us all. Some people would, for example, be within a corporate environment but use entrepreneur skills, and I think in America the term is intrapreneur, which is the entrepreneur that works within a large company. So they use that entrepreneurial spirit, but they're in-house essentially. And I think entrepreneurism is not, in many respects, it's sort of overlooked and unvalued. I think leadership is probably where I would most celebrate. I think entrepreneurialism is a sort of precursor to leadership. So you've got to be able to back yourself if you're an entrepreneur. You're unlikely to be following directly anything else if you're an entrepreneur, and actually both those qualities are fundamental to leadership as well. You also don't tend to just simply agree with something because that's what we've always done. Again, that's a leadership quality. So I think it is that entrepreneurism is may well be what I've got, may well be what Nikki's got. In kind of my, I'm more obsessed with and eat up kind of lessons about lessons of leadership and impressions of leadership, where as in an impression made on me, not sort of not mocking or mimicking leadership. I don't mean that, but where you think, crikey, what a hell of, that is such a demonstration of leadership. And you see that.
You then, who off the top of your head, without thinking about it?
Oh Lord, Mo Molan was one of the biggest people to inspire me. She was the Northern Ireland secretary that oversaw the Northern Ireland Peace Process, and John Hume, who was a Northern Irish politician who was hugely influential in the Northern Ireland peace process. Harold Wilson, Clement Attlee, Tony Blair. These are men and women of huge stature. Harriet Harman in the Labour Party. On a political sense, Nelson Mandela, I should think, is probably one of the people that, of your 70 podcasts, I should think Nelson Mandela has been mentioned 3/4 of the time. If not, he should be. Jacinda Ardern at the moment, New Zealand, she's bossing it, isn't she? So there's a lot of people to be inspired. But actually also, whilst I was not a fan of much of what she did and represented, you can't help but be impressed by the resilience that Theresa May showed as Prime Minister. She got some things spectacularly wrong, but I never doubted that she had a sense of duty and integrity at the heart, and that is not something I would say about Boris Johnson.
No, I agree with you totally there. True servant leadership, I think. we've had
very much so. Very much so.
Well, I think that this has been a very nice conclusion with one final question. Have I potentially just interviewed a future Prime Minister?
Oh Lord, I didn't know you were asked that.
I know.
Yes, I'd love to. I'd love to be. I'd love to be a minister in the Labour government. That's what I would most like to be. I think we're at a crossroads as a country. I think the pandemic is the biggest event of my lifetime, biggest global event of my lifetime. And I think if you consider the kind of rebuild narrative of a country that's just borrowed more than it ever spent in both world wars and endured more losses than in both world wars, of losses of life than in both world wars, off the back of that, we built a welfare state, the National Health Service. Fast forward to the Wilson government, we had the white heat of technology, the revolution of industry, and the creation of the Open University and lifelong learning. Fast forward, I mean, I'm giving you my Labour history rather than anything else, but I don't discount that improvements have happened in other governments as well. But I think we're at that moment again, and I think that what this pandemic has shown is the creative force of the will, or where the will is behind a creative force for good, then politicians and the political process to decide to invest, to prioritize, to give focus to innovative healthcare, innovative vaccine creation, and pull together. These are really powerful sentiments. And whilst the losses are very real and tragic in so you know, in every single case for families all over, life will go on, and we must keep it in the rear view and assess what's just gone. But as we look up the road, how are we doing things better? How is the injustice that's baked in to our society going to be redressed? And how do we lift everybody up and on, rather than simply those that have the good fortune to be strong enough right now? And I think this, you know, this is that moment.
I agree. And I know who I'll be supporting. Well, there you go.
Well, you shouldn't disclose that on this. You'll lose listeners.
Oh, I don't. Well, that's fine. The people know I'm Marmite, James. I'm very candid in what I talk about. Well, there you go. You heard it here first, and we will know for prosperity whether it came true or not. Thank you so much, because I know you're really busy, and
Thanks,
you know, much thanks to you. And obviously, please pass my best on to Nikki, and we really appreciate you joining us on the Recruiters Recruitment Podcast.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Thank you.